Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. As we have seen in our episodes on Amos, Tutuola, and Buekes, the depiction of interspecies ontology and the blurring of boundaries becomes a central device for establishing the equivalence between the fantastic and the real that defines magical realism. A contrastive handling of the blurring of boundaries between the human and the animal and insect worlds is provided at the very start of Robert Cresch's What the Crow Said, where the description of the potentially disconcerting rape of the young Vera by a swarm of bees inaugurates a whole series of boundary transgressions between the animal and the human worlds. But Cresch goes much further by also introducing a vast gallery of disabled characters and making it unclear whether they are simply indexical of real-life conditions in the Canadian prairie setting or rather iconic representations of a sense of liminality. The rape of Vera is rendered in such an aestheticized way as to take it out of the domain of the strange and uncanny completely. The narrator first speculates about what her terror must have been at the soft caress of those touching bees, what ultimate desperation caught in her throat at the ferocious and innocent need of those homeless bees, something which it seems she never told, thus leaving the matter of her response to the unusual event purely speculative. Later on, Vera is described as actively participating in an act which is simultaneously oppressive and pleasurable. Her eyelids were each a bee, her armpits open to the nuzzling bees. They found the spaces between her fingers, between her toes. Her body was not hers now. It moved with a surge of grass in the wind, a field of green oats, a flowering of clover. Her moving crushed the blue-purple petals of the crocus bed, broke the hairy stalks, the blossoms into dizzying sweetness of her own desire. The hum of wings melded earth and sky into the thickness of her skin. She had no mind left for thinking, no fear, no dream, no memory. The bees had closed her mouth, her ears. The bees found the swollen lips between her thighs. She felt their intrusive weight and spread further her legs. Then she gave her cry. The passage defines a highly sensuous, expressive field, full of color, such as with reference to the field of green oats and purple petals, with words suggestive of tactility, nuzzling, crushed, broke, melded, as well as of sounds, hum, all of which combine with a sense of her pleasure, dizzying sweetness, no mind left for thinking, no fear, no dreaming, etc., such that the cry she gives at the end is orgasmically suspended between pleasure and pain. The main achievement of the passage is to aestheticize what should really be a highly disturbing experience, thus essentially assimilating a fantastic incident, her transformation into a queen bee, into a normal register of love-making, tipping dangerously into sexual assault. This aesthetic effect is not dissimilar to what W.B. Yeats achieves in Leda and the Swan, mainly because what is an essentially uncanny occurrence, the rape of a young woman by a swan, is written so as to invite us to contemplate it as an aesthetic tableau amenable to multiple interpretations, and thus not simply reducible to the code of the uncanny. In What the Crow Said, this rape, lovemaking, is further normalized by virtue of the fact that Vera always refers lovingly to bees. The son she gives birth to is referred to simply as Vera's boy and seems to be merely a lonely child with a speech effect in which he produces a buzz-like confusion of sounds. But this seeming disability is redeemed by the fact that he also has the unusual ability to predict the turns of the weather, which, for the harsh Canadian prairie community of Big Knife, in which the novel is set, makes him an indispensable member of the community. What the Crow Said is often held up as an exemplar of Canadian magical realism, and for good reason. The completely deadpan manner in which fantastic elements are introduced into the text, and the fact that the characters themselves show absolutely no surprise at the various incredible occurrences that take place, mark it out as a supreme example of magical realism. Like other magical realist novels, What the Crow Said arranges events to take place in a number of ordinary chronotopic spaces that easily fade in and out of the foreground of narration. These include Tiddy's kitchen, her daughter's bedroom, the outdoors, as well as the earth and the sky. However, the juxtapositions in the novel turn not on the distribution of these ordinary spaces, but on the difference between the indexicality of Canadian history as grounded in the prairie environment depicted in the novel, and the possibilities of iconicity encapsulated in the titular crow or the title, in various disabled characters, as well as in events such as the impregnation of a woman by bees. As we saw in our interregnum theoretical episode last week, there is a critical difference between the indexical and the iconic and how they appear in magical realism. In What the Crow Said, the indexical makes itself visible primarily in relation to the geographical location of the community of Big Knife, described as being ambiguously situated somewhere between Alberta and Saskatchewan. This geographical location provides an avenue for contextualizing the harsh and unrelenting natural environment we find in the novel. The descriptions first of snow, a sultry spring, and then the war between the earth and the sky all index the harsh prairie geography of Canada. Stephen Slimon has suggested that What the Crow Said encapsulates the full range of Canadian history, so that the passage of only a few seasons contains several years of calendar time and of all colonial history from the horse and buggy period to the appearance of oil derricks on the Canadian prairies. The second indexical element in What the Crow Said, however, is less easily linked to a specific reality of Canadian prairie history, unless we assume that the vagaries of the harsh environment are necessarily tied to the proliferation of disabilities. There is no historical evidence that this was indeed the case. The novel displays a wide range of disabilities, most of which are attributed to prairie work, as if to suggest that this particular Canadian geographical environment exacts disabilities as the price for settling it. As we shall see in a moment, even if this is directly indexical of the harsh realities of life on the prairie during the period of settler colonialism, its significance goes beyond the indexical to touch on the iconic. In mentioning characters with impairments and disabilities, I have deliberately suppressed two highly significant characters whom I want to now introduce into the discussion as part of the category of the iconic and liminal. These are Vera's boy, fathered by the bees at the beginning of the novel, and J.G. or John Gustave, the son of T.D. Lang, mother of the Lang girls, and the long-suffering Penelope figure within the subtle Homeric undertow that runs throughout the novel, and that includes the rape of Vera by bees and her progressive transformation at the end of the novel into an irresistible siren, drawing men inexorably to their deaths. Both Vera's boy and J.G. raise implications for the juxtaposition of different ontologies. Of the two child characters, by far the most important is J.G. because of his explicit connection to the tutelar crow of the novel. Two things immediately define J.G. as liminal. One is that the circumstances of his conception are conveyed in the vaguest of terms, so that it is never clear whether he was fathered by John Scandal, who had won out against all the other suitors and married the bereaved T.D. Lang, or Gus Liebhaber, whose frozen body T.D. thawed with her own in a highly eroticized set of descriptions. Liebhaber is extremely possessive in this regard. As we are told, when years later any drunk or fool or hero had Dutch courage enough to suggest it was Big John Scandal who sired the strange child, he had, in the instant of his speaking, to deal with Liebhaber's unaccountable wrath, the wrath of a man who could be aroused to fighting by nothing else on the face of the earth, but who, in that one matter of ultimate truth, would take on a man twice his size, would take on two opponents, three. J.G. is described as too handsome to look like anyone. But there was one complication nevertheless. When he cried, he made no sound, a condition of silence he was to maintain throughout his life. There are subtle suggestions that J.G. is severely autistic, his silence and his fascination for puzzles providing telling clues for this condition. More significant, however, is that from the moment he is brought home from the hospital, J.G. is inextricably aligned with Crow, a link that remains unchanged until his death, when he jumps from the branch of a tree in imitation of a bird, upon which Crow himself flies away, never to be seen again in the narrative. A bunch of crows is referred to at the very end of the novel, but these caw rather than speak, and there is no indication that Crow is one of them. Here is how the link between the autistic child and Crow is first established in the novel. Liebhaber, it was mid-morning, he'd fallen asleep in the old easy chair on T.D.'s porch. Liebhaber awakened and saw the crow perched on the buggy, its head cocked, staring at the baby, his eyes open, staring at the crow. The crow perched on the back of a chair for hours. Sometimes it sat on a gatepost by the untrimmed caragana hedge and cocked its head at the condescending remarks of visitors. Occasionally, it hopped on the ground to peck up a bug or a seed, but mostly it preferred to be fed from its special dish on the porch. Liebhaber soon came to address his remarks directly to the crow, rather than to the inattentive baby, complaining bitterly that Tiddy was whimsical, pernickety, high-hearted, stuck up, and a blue-eyed terror. Sometimes he raised his voice, hoping to be heard inside the house as well, but Tiddy ignored his every insult and entreaty, his every cry of pain. The baby J.G., Crow, and Liebhaber form a trio of different interlocutors on Tiddy's porch, with the baby and crow staring at each other, and Liebhaber addressing his bitter remarks on life to Crow rather to the inattentive baby. Later, Crow is to speak, upon which there is a telling piece of speculation within the community. People, years later, insisted that it learned to talk from listening to Liebhaber piss and moan about the world. He was always pissing and moaning, people said. Whether or not the crow was speaking what was on the silent child's mind, that was never clearly determined. But there were those who insisted that the black crow sometimes spoke on behalf of JG. By this stage, we are encouraged to see Crow as a metonymic displacement of the absent voice of JG. But if JG is autistic, as we might argue, then what exactly is the status of Crow as a supervening magical realist signifier of a different ontology of space and time? It is clear that Crow cannot be indexical of real-life crows, but that he is an iconic allegorical symbol of something much more complex. This is what distinguishes him from the bunch of crows that caw at the end of the novel. As a symbol, the ordinary crow has a long pedigree in folk narratives all over the world. In the myths of the Norsemen, Odin has two crows perched on each shoulder. In certain traditions, the crow is seen as both a trickster figure, such as among the Chippewayan people of eastern Canada, as well as a spokesperson of divine will or authority. The Navajo ironically refer to the missionaries as crows because of their black robes. And in Ted Hughes's poetry collection titled Crow, From the Life and Songs of Crow, we have a depiction that looks very close to the cynical crow of KROETSCH'S representation. In KROETSCH'S novel, Crow adopts an overtly cynical tone toward everything. Like Hughes's Crow, Crow in KROETSCH'S novel performs an eye of God function that links the earth to the sky as the locations of different ontological possibilities. At the same time, the point of metonymically linking the crow to the autistic JG is to assert his presence as an icon of the ever-present potential for decay, loss, and the impossibility of self-becoming in the social world of the prairie town. In other words, Crow is not indexical of real crows, but rather iconic of two confounding opposites, an observant yet incompetent God and the signifier of decrepitude and decay, as if to negate the two meanings potentially invested in the two poles of signification. Since the liminality of Vera's boy and JG derive from their simultaneous occupation of mixed indexical and iconic registers, they come to encapsulate both the symbolic generativity and the collapse of meaning inherent in disability that are known to have been historically tied to the material rhythms and conditions of society from antiquity to the present day. The novel then proliferates disabilities as sharp critiques of the society that produces it. It is now time to return to Slemon's contention that the temporal cycles of the community of Big Knife provide the key lineaments of prairie history. While the indexical attributions of Big Knife as a signifier of Canadian prairie history is largely correct, it obscures one cardinal feature of that history. For what the crows said seemed to have no interest whatsoever in attending to the ways in which the European settlers overran Aboriginal society in Canada. It becomes blatantly obvious from the names of the central characters in the novel that they are all Europeans. Gus Liebhaber, Mick O'Halloran, Martin Lang, John Scandal, Leo Weller, and so on. The only indigenous character in the entire novel is Joe Lightning, who is said to be from the Cree tribe. He is distinctive for at least two reasons. First is that he is the only one to marry one of the Lang girls for what is taken to be real love. And second is that he is the only male in the entire community that refuses to either drink or join the other men playing the lengthy card game that occupies an inordinate amount of time in the novel. And yet nowhere does the novel convey any consciousness of a colonial relation between the settler and Cree communities. Whatever historically oppressive relations there were between settlers and Aboriginal Canadians are transposed onto the proliferation of disabilities tied not to the Aboriginals but to the settlers, as if they are the only ones on whom the price is extracted by the harsh geographical environment. This is clearly a white mythology, as elaborated by Robert Young and various others. Thus, what appears to be the peculiar magical realist ontology of prairie indexicality is also a ruse for the avoidance of the violence of the history of settler colonialism in Canada. Thank you. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.